So now, even though 1945 isn't such a crucial date for South America, nonetheless, let's talk about the early post-Second World War refraction of the Spanish Civil War lens in some of the cases, some of the countries that you've studied especially closely. So Guatemala would be one, Cuba would be another one, Argentina would be a third one with this more bizarre singular thing, which is Peronismo, which can be claimed from the left sometime, but still has very strong links to Francoism in particular. And then the one that is probably the more spitting mirror image of the Spanish Revolution, or at least using it more adamantly as its lens, which is Chile.
Yes. So, and this is another, I think, advantage of approaching the question of the Spanish Civil War from outside of Europe, right? Because there is a whole sort of, discourse that the Spanish Civil War was the kind of opening act, it was the dry run, it was the dress rehearsal for World War II, right? It was basically a proxy war of aggression on the part of the Axis powers, and as soon as it ends, it's basically immediately superseded by the real show, which is World War II, right? And that is a kind of a Europe-centric framework, I think. In Latin America, where again World War II it's important, obviously, they don't want to minimize it, but the 1930s in Spain are not immediately superseded by the Second World War, in part because the sequelae, not just the aftermath or the legacies, but like the very real relationships of people, resources, ideas, texts transatlantically actually kind of intensifies after the fighting ends in Spain. So for example, I have, letters, correspondence from phalangists in the Americas who say, it was great once the war ended because we could actually get access to all of these phalangist texts that we had a really hard time getting during the war because, shipping was interrupted, because they weren't being printed by the government publishing houses in the way that they were once Franco took power, et cetera. So it became much more easy for Latin American right-wingers to access the sort of intellectual apparatus, such as it was, of the right-wing coalition that ends up cohering into Franco's unitary party. Then there is, of course, this massive exodus of exiles, Republican exiles. And, the numbers are not huge. Like far greater numbers of Republican exiles end up staying in France than actually make it across the ocean. But it's still probably about 40,000 people, which is a lot of people, of whom by far the lion's share go to Mexico. And then smaller shares go, there's actually so there's 3 countries that officially accept Republican refugees while the Spanish Civil War is going on in Latin America. One is Mexico, which is governed by its own basically kind of popular frontist in all but name government of Lázaro Cárdenas, that's sort of doing the most of any post-revolutionary government to actually implement the ideals of the Mexican Revolution. And Cárdenas basically makes himself the number one ally of the Republic. It doesn't have the resources that the Soviet Union could contribute, which were themselves far less than what the Axis powers contributed to Franco, but which nevertheless was more than Mexico. Mexico could provide boundless solidarity and not a ton of resources, right? But one of the things that they did was they welcomed from the jump large numbers of refugees. And those refugees ended up having, really important impacts in a whole variety of aspects of Mexican cultural and political and economic life. So fine, there's that. Then the second country that officially takes in Republican refugees is Chile. And that's in much smaller numbers. They take about 3,000 of them, most of whom come on a single boat that is the political project of Pablo Neruda, the poet, who is serving So Chile is the third country in the 1930s to elect a formally popular, self-identifyingly popular front government, right after France and Spain. And so Chile elects its popular front in 1938. And so it's late in the Spanish Civil War, but Neruda is sent to Paris as a special consul of the Chilean Popular Front government with the charge of figuring out a way of bringing some Republicans back to Chile, despite the fact that the Chilean right is like, no, don't bring all of these Marxists, this is terrible. And so Neruda arranges the transfer of this shipload on a boat called the Winnipeg that arrives in Valparaiso in 1939, and very famously Salvador Allende, who was the Minister of Health in this Popular Front government, goes to the dock to personally receive these refugees, a number of whom end up actually occupying very important roles in his government once he's elected to power in 1970. So there's a whole kind of story there of this infusion of the Republican project and Republican exile ideas into the longer running project of the Chilean left. The third country that officially accepts Republican refugees for a period of time, and this is the weird one, is the Dominican Republic. The Dominican Republic is ruled by the brutal Trujillo dictatorship at the time, and so you wouldn't think, oh, Trujillo is someone who sympathizes with the Republic. He was a hardcore Hispanist. He loved Franco. He was, very in with Franco once the dictatorship sets in Spain. But the other thing that Trujillo is profoundly racist against Haitians in particular. And in 1937, his regime had carried out this vicious massacre of Haitians along the Dominican-Haitian borderlands, known as the Parsley Massacre. And so Trujillo had he was looking for a way to sort of repair his reputation on the international scene, and also to continue his ongoing project of trying to whiten the Dominican population. And so the idea of being able to bring in an infusion of proper Spaniards, even if they were leftists, was worth it to him. And so there's a population of about 5,000 Republican refugees who come to the Dominican Republic under Trujillo. Then Trujillo realizes, I think, what their sort of ideological valence was, and he cuts it off. But those migrants, before they all end up basically leaving the Dominican Republic because they're like, we left one dictatorship, we don't want to end up in another one. They go to Mexico, they go to Cuba, they go elsewhere. But not before forming the DR's first communist party, organizing agrarian workers in the Dominican countryside, etc. So there's this whole kind of lovely little history in which Trujillo gets a certain comeuppance by virtue of the terrible racist logic by which he allowed a group of these Republican exiles to relocate. Anyway, this is all tangents, but this story, this book that I'm writing, is this collection of just the wildest little tangents like this. Anyhow, after the war ends, exiles come as they can, although the Second World War makes it increasingly difficult for folks to transit. And so there's sort of a wave of refugees that relocate to the Americas in 1939 and 1940, and then a second wave who come in like 1947, 48, 49, once the incipient UN kind of International Refugee Agency creates a program to try to facilitate their exit. And those folks are important, not least because what ends up relocating with these exiles to the Americas is what remains of the Republican government, which then tries to reconstitute itself in exile, first in Paris and then in Mexico City, and tries to do the work of continuing to fight the fight against Franco from the diaspora. And they're not successful. But there's a number of years in which kind of the politics of what's going on in Latin America are essential to basically whether the Franco regime is able to hang on and outlast the war or not. So you mentioned Argentina. Argentina, under Perón, basically, and then after Perón, under Perón, provides an economic lifeline to Franco that allows him to survive the really tricky sort of 1946 to 1950 period in which you would think that having won the Second World War and having defeated fascism, the Allies would get around to saying, well, Franco, you are a right-wing theocratic dictator who was installed by Nazis. You don't get to stay in charge anymore. We are going to remove you, and we are going to force democratic elections in Spain. This is what the exiles thought would happen. No one imagined when they fled that Franco was going to run Spain for 35 years. No, that was not, his dictatorship felt very ephemeral in the beginning. And so the efforts to keep Spain exiled from the nascent UN and all of its institutions, to try and kind of maintain Franco as like a pariah state, were both led by Latin American diplomats, Mexicans, Guatemalans, Uruguayans, and also undermined by Latin Americans, Perón in particular, who, because of various affinities with, again, the place where the political spectrum becomes a circle, third way corporatism, right, and certain kinds of elective affinities there, Perón ends up actually kind of supporting Franco while this other set of Latin American actors are working to defeat him. And it's not until 1955, when Franco's Spain is finally let into the UN, that Franco says, aha, I have finally won the Spanish Civil War. That's his quote. Not till 1955. So again, like, this is where I think the language of like afterlives and legacies serves us not that well. And the concept of like survie or supervivencia or whatever serves us a lot better, because the Spanish Civil War didn't stop happening in 1939. It just changed form. It started happening in some different locations. But the core kind of ideological and political conflicts motivating at the engines of it don't just shut off on April 1st, 1939, because Franco declares victory. It just becomes a different kind of war. Right? A different kind of war of position for whether or not this regime is going to survive, and is going to totally give the lie to the idea, to the self-flattering narrative of the West, that it conclusively defeated fascism in 1945 and ushered democracy into the world, because that was bullshit. They just let Franco keep throwing political prisoners in jail and murdering people for 3 more decades, because Franco made Spanish territory available for the building of US military bases at the mouth of the Mediterranean, because he rehabilitated himself as a useful ally in what was now the global fight against anti-communism. And so that's the sort of beginning of that story. And in Guatemala, which had been, so the first country, actually before Hitler's Germany and before Mussolini's Italy, the first countries to actually officially recognize the nationalist insurgency as the legitimate government of Spain were Guatemala and El Salvador. And so Guatemala was, kind of a long-running dictatorship. And then the reason why 1945 is really important in Latin America is not because it's the end of the Second World War per se, but it's because domestic reformers and leftists, but progressives, I think, a kind of popular front coalition of folks, take seriously the narratives of the Western powers that, okay, fascism is done, we're doing democracy now, and we're not going to get in the way if you all try to do democracy in your own countries. They all said, great. And across the whole hemisphere, there was this massive set of peaceful revolutions that overthrew dictatorships from Guatemala all the way down to the Southern Cone. And so that was really consequential. And one of the places that happens is Guatemala, where there is this kind of reformist nationalist revolution that yields the first ever democratic elections in the country. They extend the vote to the indigenous majority of the population that had never before been able to vote.
That's 44?
45, yeah. And they start instituting steps toward what becomes a kind of more thoroughgoing agrarian reform in 1952 and whatever. But they have this democratic government, and they know that they are up against the same political phenomena, the same kind of brewing backlash, the same constellation of forces that rose up to destroy the Republic. They identify themselves very much with the Republican project, and they see coming the counter-revolution. The thing that they don't see coming is the United States then deciding, okay, we're going to pick sides and then give the counter-revolution massive amounts of communications equipment, training, guns, political cover, planes, propaganda, all of this stuff. But otherwise, the kind of the basic dynamic of we are doing a democratic, social democratic project. We're doing an elected social democratic project unto a country that we want to modernize. We want to do some land reform. We want to do some political opening. We want to legalize unions. We want to legalize strikes. We want to legalize the Communist Party. We want to actually do democratic pluralism. That is the thing that the Republic did, and that was the thing that they had to destroy. And we know that they will come for us too. And then they did. And the counter-revolution, as it came into being in Guatemala, was overtly phalangist in inspiration, in the writings of its key protagonists, in the way that they framed their whole, it's a country that's majority indigenous. And so the idea of Spanishness, of Hispanidad as being the fount of civilization to be imposed upon indigenous barbarism is very, very extra resonant there. And this is a country where the oligarchs assiduously trace their bloodlines back to the original 16th century conquistadors, and explicitly so. And so they are very invested in the idea that it is Spanish imperialism and Spanishness that are the tools with which the native barbarity must be contained and extirpated and reshaped. And so that whole set of tropes is very, very useful when they're trying to recruit a basically consensus for the counter-revolution that they effectuated in 1954. And then it gets all tangled up in, sort of US geopolitics and the CIA and the United Fruit Company and whatever. But the reality is that before...
Which is the next question.
Is it?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, but the reality is that before the coup that succeeded in 1954 in overthrowing Arbenza's democratically elected government, hounding all of its supporters into exile, and erecting a Hispanist fascist military dictatorship on top of the ashes of that project, before that coup succeeded, the one that the US threw in on, there had been dozens and dozens of previous coup attempts against those two democratic administrations from 44 to 54, which is the same period of time that Franco was fighting for his life, trying to get himself into the UN, doing secret pacts with the Vatican, with the United States government, etc., kind of reorganizing himself as this paladin of Cold War anti-communism. At the same time, these Guatemalans who realize that this counter-revolution is coming for them are at the UN fighting for the Republic. It's not that there's like a 1939 and then this after, it's all the same thing, right? It is a political continuum in which they understand themselves very clearly to be living a version of what their Republican counterparts had lived. And in part, that's because there are Republicans there in Guatemala. They did a resettlement campaign there too, telling them all about it, and experiencing that sense of deja vu as the counter-revolution is realized.